Thanks, Pinjeru, and thanks everyone for joining us, including online. This most recent research on decentralisation and local government really stems out of a conversation that Diana had in 2012 with a senior government official in Malawi, and he commented that as far as central government was concerned, local government was something of a black box. They didn't know really in detail how local government was working. And with the coming of the new council and the new councillors who are now in place, this was quite worrying, and DFID Malawi, with the support of government, commissioned some work from ODI to find out how local government was working, how it was delivering services, and just as importantly, they wanted to know why things work as they do. And so last year, a team of Malawian researchers, led by Edge and by Diana, collected data in 2 districts. That was Dedza in the centre of the country and Rumpy in the north, and one city, Blantyre, in the south. And they were looking at the workings of local government, concentrating on 3 sectors, and that was health, education, and water and sanitation. Now, in a short while, Diana's going to be talking a bit about what we found in the districts and in the city, but we quickly realised that in trying to figure out why things worked as they do, we needed to look upwards. We needed to look up at national politics to understand how national politics was affecting local politics and governance. And so just to show you the order of the presentation, firstly I'm going to give a brief overview of political settlements, and I'm going to talk a bit about the national politics in Malawi. And then Diana next is going to describe some of the concrete case studies from our fieldwork and show how these national politics, these national dynamics are affecting local governance. And then Andrew is going to, drawing on a report that OPM wrote last year, which is complementary, he's going to talk a little bit about the health sector in Malawi and focus on the relationship between local government and citizens. And then finally, Edge is going to wrap it all up by looking forward to the question of the role of the new councils and whether they can improve services. So first of all, you may have noticed, but in development circles, the term political settlement has gradually been creeping into the jargon. It's actually been around for some time in academic circles. It was introduced by Mushtaq Khan, he coined it, and it's been picked up by several of the big development research centres, and they've been using it to try and understand things as varied as conflict, corruption, growth. And so I think because of this, because the big research centres have picked up, it's been slowly permeating into development policy. Mushtaq Khan says that a political settlement can be used to describe the social order based on political compromises between powerful groups in society that sets the context for institutional and other policies. He goes on to say that a political settlement is the combination of power and institutions that is mutually compatible and also sustainable in terms of economic and political viability. Okay, so you might think, okay, what does that mean? So from that definition, I'm going to pull out 3 of the main features of political settlements. First of all, political settlements rest on an elite bargain, and this means that the most powerful groups within a society agree firstly on the distribution of power between them, but also on the rules of the game, the who gets what, when and how resources, how benefits, how privileges are going to be distributed and allocated between the most powerful groups. Secondly, however, this distribution of power within a society really does influence the type of bargains that are struck. We shouldn't be misled by the term elite bargain to think that elites can sit down at a table and just come up with whichever rules they choose. The rules of the game are really very much influenced by concrete social and political circumstances of a country, and particularly important in the political settlement framework is the distribution of power between different political organisations, and also the relationship between political organisations on the one hand and economic firms, economic organisations on the other. And then finally, for a settlement to be a settlement, it must have some degree of longevity, it must have some stability. And this stability comes from the idea that the main players, the main political players, the most powerful ones, do agree on the rules of the game, but it also needs to be economically sustainable. The rules about how resources are produced, how they're distributed, need to maintain at least a degree of an economic base that can sustain the political settlement. Now, I've put this typology up not because I'm going to go into any detail, but this is Kahn's four-part typology of political settlements. And I just put it there because I just want to make a couple of points. The first one is that there are different types of political settlements. There isn't just one settlement in advanced economies and one type of settlement in developing economies. There are different types, and these are the 4 that Kahn describes. The other point to make is that what we see in Malawi is that towards the end of Banda's one-party state in the 1980s, we have a dominant party settlement that gradually breaks down. And one of the arguments is that one of the reasons it broke down is because it was no longer economically viable. And then you see a transition in the right bottom quadrant to competitive clientelism, another type of political settlement. And there was a transition to this during the democratic transition in 1994. And this is the type of settlement that has remained pervasive in Malawi since then and still in place through the last elections. So how do we know that Malawi has this competitive clientelist settlement? What are its main features? Firstly, one key feature of this type of settlement is that the main political groupings are quite evenly matched in terms of their power, their relative power. There's no one dominant single political organisation that can enforce the rules, force their will on other organisations. And I think we see this in the results of the recent elections in Malawi, that the different parties are quite evenly matched. Secondly, and this is the competitive part of the term competitive clientelism, is the idea that political elites agree to compete for power regularly in relatively free and fair elections, and that the strongest organisation will then take power. And often violence can occur in these type of settlements if someone tries to fix the election and if someone tries to stop the strongest, most powerful organisation from taking power. And then third, and this is the clientelist part of the term competitive clientelism, is the idea that patronage and personalised relationships is very much the glue that holds together these political organisations. And that's both in terms of relationship between alliances, between factions, so at a horizontal level, but also very much in how MPs or politicians appeal and relate to their voters and their supporters. And we see this in Malawi both in the deals that are struck between parties before and after elections, this one and previous ones, but also in this pervasive pressure that you see on MPs to directly deliver development in private or group benefits to their supporters, their constituents. And then finally, these types of settlements, you'll normally see a fluid party system for all of these reasons. In Malawi, parties are highly personalised. They normally coalesce around a single individual or a family. They're based on ethnicity and region, which once again reared its head in the last election. But at the same time, there's actually quite little loyalty or attachment within parties. And we see this lack of institutionalisation of the party system and the fragmentation in the party system in Malawi. Since the transition, you've got this gradual increase in the number of parties. And not only that, you normally have parties that develop out of conflicts or fallouts between leaderships in one party. So you'll have a conflict at the top, and then a new party emerges. And you know, this has happened twice now with presidents at the head of a relatively new party. And we also see it in what's called chameleon politics, which are also very pervasive in Malawi, and that's where individual MPs or politicians move between parties. So they may be UDF, and then they're DPP, then they're PP, sorry. And you also see it in the tendency of MPs to cross the floor of Parliament. They'll cross and they'll join the ruling party when they're incentivised to do so. And in the growth of independent candidates, we've really seen this in Malawi, where there's been this real growth in independent MPs. If you're not selected in your primary, you might then stand as an independent, get into Parliament, and then perhaps rejoin one party or other once you're in Parliament. Okay, so just to finish up my section, why do we think this is important for local government and services? You know, why is this idea of political settlements interesting? We do go into this in a lot more detail in our report, but I just want to highlight two key factors that have really had a cascading effect on policy and institutions around local government. The first factor is that because patronage is so important to how elites win and also keep hold of power, there is really little incentive to decentralise resources, to devolve power to local government. And also we've seen that presidents have feared that if they cede power to local government level, that this can then be used as a base by opposition parties to build their organisational strength, and then they may win in the next election. So we have this tension on the one hand between Malawi's formal commitments to decentralisation, which is a legal commitment in the Local Government Act, in the decentralisation policy since 1998, and then on the other hand, these informal incentives that really mean that there isn't much motivation to push ahead with decentralisation. And this tension has really resulted in a lack of commitment to decentralisation at the top of government, and particularly in the office of the president. And instead what we've seen over the past 15 years is real ad hoc, lacklustre decentralisation processes. There's been resistance within individual ministries, and there's also been a lack of coordination within central government around the decentralisation that has taken place. And what we call this in the report is a lack of policy coherence, a lack of a coherent approach to decentralisation and also some of the other sector policies. And what has this resulted in is actually very limited decentralisation in practice. There's been devolution of mainly administrative functions, but there's been very meaningful devolution of decision-making or fiscal functions. And the different sector departments within local government are effectively really still operating as field officers of their respective line ministries. It's not devolution as such, it's more deconcentration of administrative functions. And instead of, as in the law, what was envisaged was a very integrated local government, a one single administrative unit with sectors, with the executive, the secretariat. They're still operating very individually. And this lack of coordination and unity of purpose at the top, therefore, has very real implications for the institutions and systems that we find at local government level. Diana's going to talk about this a bit more, but what we found was legal confusion, overlapping jurisdictions and mandates between different departments, and also a fragmentation of functions. So you'll have a single function such as payroll or procurement, but it's carried out by several different actors, both within local government and also different departments within local and central government, but there's very little coordination, effective coordination between the two. So the bottom line is really this: local government institutions aren't working well to deliver services. They're not really motivating stakeholders to work together to deliver goods and services, and so we're seeing collective action failures at different levels of government. And they're not really motivating in the main civil servants to consistently enforce and comply with the formal rules that govern local government. And so this leads to problems of weak discipline and weak control at local government level. Okay, I'm going to finish there, and I'm going to hand over to Diana.